So I've been doing it wrong for 34 years. Oh. Welcome back, everybody. Just a quick shout out to everyone who sent such nice comments. Also to all the people who sent me ideas for future videos. And it was really nice to see that a lot of those ideas were things I already have on a list of things to talk about. So stay tuned. I thought the first thing to do was make a video about adhesion. I recently saw in an advertisement something called the most important advancement in adhesive dentistry. So I had to read on. And upon reading, I found, well, it's nothing new. It was first talked about in the late 90s, but that's okay. I don't mind these techniques resurfacing if someone thinks they could be maybe applied better or differently, and I think it's always great to explore. What they're referring to is something called immediate dentin sealing versus delayed dentin sealing, and something called biomimetic dentistry, which, upon further reading, I realized someone had given a name to something we were doing in the early 90s when the first adhesives came out. If you remember some of the first adhesives released in the 90s, I remember the term dentinal adhesives coming up. And I think that was because they wanted the profession know that we now had adhesives that could actually predictably bond to dentin. So you had All-Bond in 1990, then followed by All-Bond 2, Optibond, and so forth and so on. For a long time they were named in generations. 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. I think around the 8th they went to like self-etch. Now everything is called universal. And it's called universal because it is telling you you can use it in a lot of different protocols. You can use it with light cure, you can use it with dual cure, and you can use it with self-cure. And that's great because making our life easier is something we all appreciate. For me, I placed my first feldspathic veneers in 1990. And it really shook my world because what I had learned in the 80s in dental school now seemed to not apply to how I could really restore teeth in the most efficient, conservative way possible. Instead of grinding things down for a crown, or maybe a gold inlay or onlay, which were rare, most people were just doing full coverage, I could now do partial coverage, adhesively placed non-metal restorations. And that opened a door to a whole new level of aesthetics that we could get when we're restoring a tooth. I mean, the only time I was crowning a tooth was if it had an existing crown or if it was severely compromised. Other than that, it was partial coverage. And what was so great about this opening of my eyes to a new way to restore teeth was that I could now be as conservative as possible. And in the early 90s, I saw that wave start. Back then it was more of a ripple, but I saw the wave start of people embracing adhesion and doing this conservative, beautiful, non-metal dentistry. So the adhesives now told dentists, you can be conservative. You can now mimic tooth structure. We could now place invisible fillings. We could now create the anatomy and just mimic something that was made by nature. And it was really an exhilarating, really emotional time in dentistry where people were just so excited about what they now could do for their patients. But I have one suggestion, especially for younger dentists. You really need to understand the history of adhesion and understand the earlier generations, because now everything is in one bottle. And the first thing you have to think about when everything's in one bottle, your primer, your adhesive, sometimes your etchant, think of it like Italian salad dressing. Have you ever left Italian salad dressing out in a bottle for a while? You'll see it separate. That's exactly what's going on in your adhesive bottle. So before you use it, make sure you or your assistant really shakes that bottle up to mix all the components. Back in the old days, we had separate primer bottles, separate adhesive bottles, and all that stuff. But you really need to understand how to use those older systems so you know what's going on in the mouth with the newer systems. So therefore, if you ever run into problems, you can usually think back and pinpoint where the problem was. So what is immediate dentin sealing versus delayed dentin sealing? Immediate dentin sealing is sealing the dentin after preparation prior to impression or scanning. It's a technique. Just like delayed dent sealing, where you do everything on the insertion appointment, is also a technique. The key premise of immediate dent sealing is to start the maturity of the bond. So therefore later you won't have those, quote, polymerization stresses when you're putting in an indirect restoration. Also, by sealing the dentin, you are basically preventing any bacterial infiltration. Therefore, on the subsequent visit, when you're inserting this indirect restoration, after you take off the temporary, you're just roughening the surface of that hybrid layer you created and etching any enamel. One thing I haven't seen addressed in the literature is something I call delay usage factor. What do I mean by that? Well, when you're putting in someone, say, upper 10 teeth, you're going to get them numb. They're going to be in the chair for a while. And afterwards, they're going to be sore. They might be a little tender from the procedure, from their jaw opening, from maybe the rubber dam clamps, something. They're not going to go and use their teeth right away. They're not going to go home and bite into apples or bite into steaks. They're going to take care with those teeth for at least 24 hours. And that's why delayed dent sealing to me works fine. And I think that's the key part to really remember, is this is just a technique. Now, I've seen the research about immediate dent sealing. Most of it's been in vitro versus in vivo. So most of it's been in the lab in a very controlled environment versus the mouth. The one research paper I did see where they looked at patients and restorations in the mouth, I didn't quite agree with their conclusions because they didn't take so many other factors into consideration when looking at the longevity of a restoration. What is the number one factor when considering longevity of a restoration? Well, occlusion. Occlusion is everything. You can put the strongest restoration in the mouth. If the occlusion is very disruptive, that restoration is going to fail. So those things are vastly more important to me than whether it was bond-in with immediate dent sealing or delayed dent sealing. But I'm not here to dispel one philosophy or another. I'm just telling you what I use. And I use, for the majority of my cases, the vast majority is delayed dent sealing. I do inadvertently use immediate dent sealing when I'm blocking out an undercut or placing a core. But that's it. And it's not intentional. It's just part of the process. And we all use immediate dent sealing when we do directs, correct? Some may ask, where's my research to support delayed dent sealing? I don't have any, except 34 years of practice doing it that way, where I'm not seeing sensitivity or failures or micro leakage or anything like that. But really, there are too many variables when you're talking about the mouth. I remember earlier in my career when I was speaking, I was very adamant about doing things a certain way. But it's funny, time changes you. When you expose yourself to other things, you realize there's more than one way to do things correctly, especially in dentistry. So for me, it's more about implementation than philosophy. So immediate dent sealing and biomimetics remind me of something that happened to me in the mid-90s. So like I said before, in the early 90s, I was doing adhesively placed conservative aesthetic dentistry, from directs to indirects. One thing that was very exciting is prep design was no longer. With an adhesively placed restoration, there is no set prep for a tooth. You basically take out what's bad, and if you have to place some kind of liner or core or build up, maybe to be able to save more tooth structure in the preparation, and when you look at the occlusion and maybe adjust the preparation for occlusion if it hasn't been already, that's it. I called this puzzle piece dentistry because who knew what that tooth was going to look like? It could look like anything, and that was the artistic part about preparing teeth I loved. And then you got a piece that would basically mimic what was lost, and you glue it together. It was puzzle piece dentistry, and it not only was conservative, but it was beautiful. You were achieving aesthetics you couldn't achieve with a PFM. These porcelain fused to metal crowns just couldn't do with an indirect resin or a ceramic restoration could do. It was so exciting at that time to actually put something in the mouth and not be able to tell it was a restoration. So I then started to expand it into endodontically treated teeth. And I would get a root canal tooth back from the endodontist, and they maybe would put a post space. Well, I would take a self-cure composite, inject it down the post space, and maybe do it just a direct resin. And then I would do just maybe an inlay or an onlay. I wouldn't necessarily grind it down for a crown. It made no sense to me why I would build this tooth up to then grind it all the way for a crown. Why don't I save what is available? And in 1997, a great research paper came out that basically said we need to rethink how we treat endodontically treated teeth. The protocol shouldn't be blindly place a crown. Assess how much tooth structure is left and then decide, is it direct or an indirect restoration? Well, thank God that research paper came out, because it made me sleep better at night, because I had already been doing it for so many years. But what I also started to do is I would utilize the pulp chamber. So I would create this kind of core onlay design, or core inlay would be one restoration, and it would involve a core. I always considered this more of an internal ferrule. Now, we're used to the ferrule principle with preparations, and it's usually an outer concept. Well, now we're utilizing the inner pulp chamber. To me, that was the ferrule I needed. And I started doing many restorations like this, and I thought this would make such a great article. I haven't seen this in the literature. I'm going to write an article about how to restore these endodontically treated teeth adhesively with a kind of a one-piece restoration. So I remember I couldn't sleep that night. I was so excited to get started the next day. The next day I pull out my slide carousels. Remember the slide carousels? Remember those days, people? Ooh, that was long. Yes, I'm old. Okay, that's for sure. So the slide carousels. And then I started writing the article. So about a week later, I'm in New York at a dental meeting, and I ran across a colleague I know. And he's a very prominent person in occlusion and adhesion. And if I said his name, you'd know it. But he asked me what I was doing, and I told him I'm writing this article on how I'm treating endodontically treated teeth with one piece non-metal restoration, and I'm bonding it in a place and all this stuff. And I was so excited. And he just kind of looked at me and went, that's the monoblock design. And I went, what? And yeah. So what I realized very quickly, very early in my career, is nothing's really new. It's just maybe reinvented because of newer materials or something like that. But these concepts and techniques are nothing new. So as you can see, the article came out in 1996. And yes, I will have to admit that was my hair. No one told me. No one told me it looked like a helmet, but it did. And anyway, right now I have about 10% of that hair, so the good thing is I'm saving on a lot of shampoo. So that experience with my first article reminded me of immediate dent and sealing and biomimetics, and I guess it's gaining some popularity now. Why? I don't know. But go ahead, learn it, try it, and judge it for yourself. But if you're used to and confident with delayed dent and sealing, I don't think there's a need to switch. I would, however, recommend a really good intraoral microedger. Those are invaluable. So I guess one of the issues for me is when I hear people claiming immediate dent and sealing is so far superior to delayed dent and sealing. Clinical reality says different. Not just me, but the vast majority of clinicians who've been doing it for 30 plus years. So I don't think it's a good idea to concentrate on which philosophy is best. What I do think is important to concentrate on is the proper techniques with whatever ideology you believe in. To me, the temporization with delayed dent and sealing is one of the keys to why it works. So I'm not having sensitivity or microleakage. And one of the best products is something called Gluma Desensitizer, because it does two things. It desensitizes, hence the name, and it kills bacteria. So in this case, where I'm taking off the direct temporaries that were made in a Luxatemp matrix, you can see right after taking off these temporaries, the teeth are spotless. And look at the health of the gums. I attribute that to two things. The Gluma, keeping the teeth clean, and the temporaries being well contoured, made from a very well done wax up. Now with the advent of printers, people are talking about printing shells. For me, I never got shells to work in my hands. It never decreased my chair time appreciably or gave me a better cosmetic result than what I could get with a well-done matrix made from a really high-quality wax-up, both aesthetically and with occlusion in mind. And filling that index with Luxitemper Integrity, putting it over those preps that were previously coated with Gluma, that to me gives me a very predictable result, and a result I know the patients will love. So for me, it's a no-brainer. But for others, I know a lot of dentists who love shells, and they swear by them. For me, it doesn't work. Do what works for you. Try some techniques, figure out what works best for you in your hands, and then just keep doing it and go for it. So will I be embracing immediate dent sealing and biomimetics? Well, immediate dent sealing, no, except for those circumstances where I talked about where I'm maybe blocking out in a prep or placing a cord. Then I am doing immediate dent sealing, but I'm not doing it on purpose. For the most part, I'm doing delayed dent sealing. As for biomimetics, well, to me that's just a name someone has given to something we've been doing since the 90s, which is conservative, aesthetic, adhesive dentistry. But I guess it's hip to call it biomimetic now. And I'm not hip. I'm old. So, and I'm not going to wear bell bottoms. Mostly because I have skinny legs. But no, I'm good. I'm good the way it is. For me, I'm going to do what I've always done and call it what I've always called it, which is conservative, aesthetic, adhesive dentistry. And in those early days, it was such a creative time because we were truly creating invisible restorations. We were building the tooth up in its natural form, cusp by cusp, ridge by ridge, putting those pit and fissure stains in the tooth. It was really something, but it also took a lot of time. Now, in the late 90s, I did this article showing a step-by-step direct resin restoration, doing all the fancy stuff. And when I moved out to California in the late 90s, I was practicing in San Francisco with an older practitioner. And he sometimes would watch me do these directs. And then I remember one time we were sitting having lunch and he looked at me and he said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, sure. And he said, "Now, are you making those direct restorations look like that for the patient or for you?" I went, again, this was another eye-opener. I thought, yeah, I'm doing it for me, my ego. We do it for show. Do I do it day in and day out? Absolutely not. I do these, quote, invisible restorations when I'm usually doing it for lectures or ads or something like that. Day in and day out, I do something like this. What is it? It's a direct composite that has good contour, well sealed, well polished. That's all you need to do. That patient isn't going to go home and say, "Boy, he didn't put that pit and fissure staining in the tooth." They're not going to do it. They just don't want to see the silver, or they don't want to see the decay. They just don't want to see an ugly tooth anymore. So we do stuff for ourselves. We have to recognize that. But why I mention this is because I don't want any dentist out there who isn't doing the 20 steps or so to do an invisible restoration think that you're doing lesser dentistry. You're not. You're doing probably great dentistry. It just is not going to be for an article, because if it was, you were probably going to make it look different. If it was for a YouTube video or if it was something you were going to show in a presentation, you'd do it differently. But that doesn't mean what you're doing now is any less successful clinically. And I just want you to know that. There's reality dentistry, and then there's stuff for publications and lectures and stuff like that. So what am I saying in all this? Well, I'm really just saying one thing, and that is do what works for you. If you think there is only one way to do things, then you either haven't practiced long enough, or maybe you really don't practice. Maybe you're more of an educator or researcher, and that's fine. We need researchers and educators, that's for sure. Now, if you think this is the best way for me to do something, but I understand there are other techniques and procedures that work equally as well, I think that's the mindset to have. Bottom line is, it needs to work for you, your patients, and your business. Also, education is key, especially for your younger practitioners. YouTube is great for basic info, but to really learn, you need to go to courses, preferably live patient programs. That's where you get your hands dirty and you get in there and treat a patient. And you're supervised by clinical educators. I taught those types of courses for many, many years. And I saw these dentists raise to amazing levels of patient care. So thank you all for sitting through this video. I hope some of you found it valuable. I'm not here to condemn or disparage. I'm just trying to share a perspective on where we have been in the profession and to talk about some things. Remember, the best philosophies and techniques are the ones that work for you and your patients. So take care, and God bless, and I hope to see you next time. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. See ya.